out. So we got to do this thing, though. I want to do this thing with you. So it's about this foundation, this thing that needs to happen for intimacy. Intimacy is not possible with unreality. I mean, some of these stories that have been coming out, about people being exposed, and their utter hypocrisy, or, like they have a secret life as a monster, it's the people that know them, they think, who did I know? Like, who is this? Like I did not know. So whatever we had, it wasn't real, right? So true intimacy absolutely depends on truth. Like that I truly know the person that I'm close to. And for us, with God, that's meant to be that foundation for intimacy and the shield that it provides. Because, when things happen that don't make sense, particularly of our relationship with God, if we don't have that foundation of intimacy secured in the truth, then the circumstances that seem to contradict that truth will really upend us. That intimacy will be broken by the pressure around it. So I'm speaking in terms of our life in God's Word of securing that kind of foundation, that kind of filter for what we allow, kind of embrace in our life, and the security of what, the protection that can bring. So I write there, true intimacy requires us to have a sure foundation of truth at the core of relationships, of our relationships. This core of truth is both a platform to build on and a protective shield to guard against misunderstanding and falsehood that can tear relationships apart. We secure this foundation and core of truth in our relationship with God through the Scriptures, which give the critical history, context, and content to our knowledge of God. In order to develop this foundation, this filter for a growing, intimate relationship with God, we have to, first of all, dig a well and not a shallow pit. We have to dig a well. We have to, when Jesus talked about springs of living water, coming forth from you, that there is a supply, there is a source of kind of water, of refreshing, renewing, essential connection with what is true that we're meant to have in God's Word. And again, because I was starting from this vantage point of love as being the first principle, or the commandment that rules all the other commandments, that it's entirely possible, both with prophecy and with the Bible, for somehow those to take the place of Christ. So when I'm talking about having a secure foundation in the Word, I'm not just talking about being like biblically literate. I'm talking about the ability to hear the voice of Jesus in His Word.
Come on.
Right? That's an ongoing, living, spring of life kind of reality for us. And that's going to happen because we dig a well, not a bunch of shallow pits. So I'm not going to minimize the challenge of this, but I am going to argue for something probably more than what we have. I grew up with a very eccentric father. My father was unusual and angry and not there. And he would get these crazy ideas, and he never finished anything. So while he was still in our home, he read somewhere, I don't know where it was, he read about Zoysia grass. Do you know what Zoysia grass is? It originated in Africa, in South Africa. It's a very hardy form of grass that propagates itself not by seed but by runners. And so the way that it's planted is it's planted in plugs of the grass, and then it spreads and takes over. It's so tough and hardy that it'll choke out everything else, like that's in the way. So my dad read about this grass and thought, wow, I'll plant that in our yard, and then we won't have any weeds. And well, so he did that in the front yard, and sure enough, it over years, 3 or 4 years, it fills in completely, and now it's completely zoysia grass. The problem was, of course, that zoysia goes dormant in the winter. We lived in the Midwest, and so it's really brown and ugly for like 6 months of the year, which is like, people actually like paint it green, you know, like it's so, but the thing he didn't foresee is how tough it is that after a few years it filled in our yard, then a few years more it filled in the neighbors' yards, and then it began to break through the street. It has the ability to kind of, like there's nothing that will stand in its way. So it's kind of like grass from hell. Like, you know, really, it is like, wow, it's like a horror movie. Who's going to stop this grass? No one is going to stop this grass. So in the backyard, he dug all the holes. Like you literally get like this little hole thing, and you dig these holes, and then you get the plugs, and he never planted the plugs. So we had this backyard that was full of little shallow holes. And pretty soon rabbits moved in, and
Nice.
but it was useless and dangerous because like I had to mow it. You could break your ankle just trying, you know, and so I feel like most people end up with a yard full of shallow holes in their life in the Word. They've read here, they've read there. You know, we're trying to draw the water, right? And most of us live in such rain-saturated, you know, our yard is so rain-saturated. By that I mean we go to church, we hear teaching, we read books, we hear someone on the radio. It's just like rain is falling on our yard. And so when we go to the Bible and we just turn over a little scoop of dirt, wow, water fills it. It's kind of muddy. It's not the best, but you can get a little sip. You can take the thirst away, and you do that often enough, you can just get all these shallow holes, and all the while you're meant to be digging with some kind of focus, some kind of strategy, you know, maybe not that much more effort, and you end up with a well that has pure water in it, that's able to give water to more than you, others. How many more? God decide. You have something cold. How many times has Jesus used the picture of a cup of cold water to give? Like that's the idea that I'm operating. You and I are meant in the Word to have a well. Enough of a well that supplies our life even when things are dry. And maybe enough to supply a small group or a whole church or a city or I don't know. Okay, how's that happen? Let's talk about these things. First of all, the challenge of the biblical material. And it is a challenge because it's diverse. Right? It is, the Bible contains narrative history. It contains poems and songs. It contains apologetics. It contains prophetic records. It contains letters. It contains gospels, which are a unique kind of biography. It contains apocalyptic material, you know, that it is using symbols and numbers and visionary elements to talk about the end of history. So it's a book with lots of types of material and from lots of different periods of time and even different authors. I remember because I became a Christian reading the Bible, I thought that was the key to evangelism. And so I would encourage my non-saved friends, I buy them a copy of the Bible and tell them to read it. And one friend, I gave him a copy of the Bible, said, you need to read this. And he came back to me and he said, you're such a liar. He said, this isn't a book, it's a library.
Yeah. Come on.
He was so right, you know. Our Protestant Bibles have 66 books. That's a library. That's a library. And so the challenge of material is not just what kind of material it is how much material there is. And as a person who was like determined to have it in my grasp, to have a well, then what I came to believe is that most people look at the 66 books in their Protestant Bible and they think, wow, there's no way that I can hold on to all of that. There's just not any way. It's like I gave you 66 ping pong balls and told you how many can you hold without getting, a basket or something. And you think, wow, so I got to use my hand to stack them up. So maybe I'd start here, I'd lean back, and I get a row of 8, then a row of 7 and 6, and maybe I could get 35 or so. But now I got to find other places to put them. So maybe I bend my head back and I put behind my leg, and how many can I get? And someone who could do 66, they'd be like a circus performer.
Right.
That's how the average Christian looks at it, like a Bible scholar.
Wow.
Like they're like a circus performer. Like they know Nehemiah, Jude, and, like, wow, like look at him balance all of that. And so it just seems impossible. And honestly, there's a true reality of our human condition. It's called the paralysis of choice. Mm-hmm. Too much choice and you don't make any choice.
Right.
You have to have enough choice to make choice. But too much choice paralyzes people. Nancy and I were part of a church that resettled some refugees in Canada, and we lived there. And they were Pentecostals that got out of the Soviet Union.
Right.
During the height of those days in the 70s in the Cold War. And so these poor Russian peasant Pentecostal families would come to Vancouver, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, and churches like ours would help resettle them, get them a place to live, get them enrolled in their English language classes. And one of the highlights, of course, of these families wanted to show them how great life is going to be in Canada, was we'd take them to the grocery store. I'll never forget one Russian woman looking at the dairy case at 20 kinds of butter. She'd only ever been in line in a store whether they had lard or not.
Right.
She thought, how in the world am I going to make this choice? She just cried. It's not possible. We have commercials all our life to help us make those choices. How do you make that choice? Some people, that's the way the Bible is. It's like 66 books. I stare at it like the refrigerator case. I don't even know where to start, much less where to finish, how to do this. The truth of it is, in terms of the way that we ought to consider the biblical material, is that it's not 66 books, it's 7 sections. There are 7 sections. So if I asked you to hold on to 7 softballs, most of us could do it. It's not going to be the easiest thing for Carl, but I believe that Carl could hold 7 softballs. And that's really more the challenge, is that I have to be able to hold on to 7 sections of Scripture. And when it comes to digging a well, then there's like a particular way. If I'm going to dig a well today just by hand, I'm of course going to use a shovel, and I'm going to mark out the circle of my well, and then I'm going to take that shovel and I'm going to wedge out the first piece, which is going to be the most difficult piece because it's it's tied into the grass and the root system, and I'm going to have to chunk that thing out. But once I have one section, chunked out, then I'm not going to go over to the opposite side and do that again where there's no benefit of part of it's missing, and I can use that leverage to help me. I'm going to go to the next section right next door. The Bible works like that. The way that we're meant to kind of hold it together is that the sections go together in a certain way. And this is my view. This is not necessarily even the way it's organized, but this is my view, that they go together. So on the back of your last page there, you have the 7 sections, and this is based on how I think they go together in terms of what they contribute to the whole. And it begins, of course, where would I tell someone to start if they're reading the Bible for the first time? What's the most important bit that I want them to get up front? And that's the life and the teaching and the ministry and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So that's the Gospels. That's where I would want them to start. So that's a whole section. There they are, the 4 Gospels. But then you're reading the Gospels and you're aware of this tension, this conflict, it's the thing that fuels the murderous intent of Jesus' enemies towards him. There's this tension with what's gone before, the law and the claims of the law. And all of that is articulated in the Bible in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. So Genesis, through Deuteronomy. So once I dig out the chunk of the Gospels and I begin to get a little familiar, then if I go there, then I'm going to get a little familiar with this law that the Gospel kind of succeeds or fulfills, and I can begin to hold those things together. Now once I have a little bit of law and Gospel out, then I'm able to understand how this good news of the salvation that Jesus brings, fulfilling the law, how that advances among those who believed it for the first time, and that's the book of Acts. Wow, one whole section, just one book, fantastic, it gets worse. But that's a particularly good thing because, wow, now I see how this gospel coming out of the law worked out in the lives of those who first followed it and believed it. And interestingly enough, what's right in the center of the book of Acts, Acts 15, the whole tension of how the gospel relates to the law.
Right.
So, okay, there's Acts, the 3rd section. Now, of course, they say, hindsight. Oh, no, I'm sorry. So the 4th thing is there's literature produced by that first community that came out of the law into the gospel and began to live that out in the first century world. And they produced a literature, that's all the letters of the New Testament, which articulate kind of the belief and the practice and the concerns and the challenge and the conflicts of that living it out. 4th section. Now hindsight is perfect. I can look back from this perspective on the history of the people who lived out the law, the historical writings of the Old Testament. That's Joshua. I can include the literature of that historic people, the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Song of Solomon. Historical writings. That's a really big section, really big, and really only truly redemptive and significant to us from the vantage point of the New Testament looking back.
That's good, yeah.
Then you have the most difficult and the most misunderstood. This group of people who God raised up to speak to his historic community about their failures and their future, and those are the prophets. And the prophets are incomprehensible apart from the historical writings and the law and the gospel and the letters. And so you have the 6th section, the prophets. And then the last, this capstone thing, the apocalyptic writings of Revelation, parts of Daniel, that deal with the end of history, and again, with a very particular kind of language and a particular kind of communication. But that rests on the top of everything else. Now the way that, of course, a well is dug is, you don't dig a well with one shovelful. You go around, complete the circle, and then you go around again. And really, wells aren't dug with shovels by hand in our world anyway, or in our country, some parts of the world. But they're dug with a drill bit that basically takes off a layer at a time of the circle, and you go round and round. And so what I'm saying is that digging a well is a long-term proposition that involves the consistent kind of digging around the pattern of these things as they fit together, and the end result will be not only increased depth, it will at one point mean that you've crossed the water line, the water table. And I imagine it like this, this is righteousness and sin work in opposite directions. Sin works on the basis of diminishing returns. Sin initially has an amazing jolt. Like, if you've never done drugs and you do drugs for the first time, it rocks your world. If you've never smoked a cigarette and you smoke a cigarette, I'm not to say that's the worst sin or something, but you'll spin on the axis of, your life. Like an amazing impact for little exposure. So little exposure, amazing kind of impact. But the problem is pursuing that impact diminishes. Like you have to do more and more to get any return. And then pretty soon, you're doing everything, and you're getting nothing out of it. It's the path of addiction. It's the path, where suddenly I'm investing all of my life, my time, money, and my emotions, and I'm getting only death back out of it. That's diminishing returns. Right. So initially it seemed like, wow, what a high, what a jolt, what a thrill, whatever. But then over time, nothing. Righteousness works the opposite. Initially it feels like I give so much, I get so little. When I first became a Christian, they told me, you got to go to church. I thought, oh God. I used to literally time the service. It was 55 minutes in our Presbyterian church, and I was bored out of my mind by minute 2. And it was the longest hour of my week. I thought, I've never understood this. How do we make Jesus boring? Like, that's a miracle. Like that takes some incredible commitment to make Jesus boring, Not, God bless, I loved the past. I loved that place, but I endured it. It was like, I'm going to endure this because that's what Christians do. Give 10% of your money. How'd that feel the first time? Like some of you think, I haven't gotten there yet, but wow, 10% of my income. Let me write that check. Whoa. Nancy and I were poor students. 10% was probably like, $15 that week. But it just seemed like a fortune. I'm going to do that over and over again. I'm going to read my Bible. Oh, but for a few parts, it's like, this is really hard and confusing. I'm going to pray. I hope I haven't told this already, but in the language of the day, it was like, go in your prayer closet and pray. I was a total pagan. We didn't have prayer closets in my house. We had clothes closets. We only had one of them. We lived in a tiny little after-the-war house, and it had one tiny clothes closet. So I got in there, sat on the canister vacuum cleaner, wedged in with the coats, and thought, wow, Christians are weird. This is what they do. Like they pray. I was in there, suffocating and praying. I thought, I can't do this for long, It's like... But with righteousness, that it seems to take so much of you and return so little. But if you persevere, that's why perseverance is the magic ingredient of spiritual living. If you persevere, if you keep writing the 10%, if you keep reading your Bible, if you keep praying, if you keep sharing your faith, if you keep worshiping with other believers, then wow, somewhere along the line it seems to even out. Like I'm getting something out of this. It's like, it's still like hard work and but I'm getting something out of it. And then at a certain point it tilts and wow, I'm getting way more out of this than I'm putting back. Where righteousness ends, we'll do the littlest nothing of something. You and I will breathe our last breath, and a dump truck load of glory will fall in our life. And we will think we have gotten everything and we did nothing. Wow. That's how it will end. And so with the Bible, you get to that point, it's like, really hard work, doing an hour long a day or putting all that time together one night a week, or this is hard, doing this week after week. And somewhere along the way though, it feels like I've got, it's like I got a conversation going, with God, and He's resourcing my life from His Word, and some of that is even being, benefiting others. And somewhere along the way with studying the Bible, and this is crossing the water table, it's like, wow, there's way more here than I've earned or worked for. That it can flow out of my life and not just be a dribble, that it doesn't have to come out religiously or anything, that there's something there to offer that's of substance, that's come because God it's in the well, and if I keep digging, it'll get bigger and purer and there'll be more of it. And so what I'm advocating is this process of digging that keeps circling through. And I don't advocate because I get bored easily. And so for me, gosh, the first time you've ever, if we could get most Christians just to read through the Bible one time, that would be like a miracle beyond proportions, because statistically they have not. But if you read through once and just did, well, I read the 4 Gospels, then I read the 5 books of Moses, and then I read the book of Acts, and then I read the letters of the New Testament, and then, wow, that was so long, it took me forever. I read the historical writings, and then I read the prophets, wow, that's weird. And then I read Revelation, wow, that's weirder. And now I've done the whole thing. After that, what I advocate is like I read one gospel, and one book of the law, and one, I read Acts every cycle through. Acts, it's very important. Yeah. Then one New Testament letter, or a couple of them. Then one section of the historical writings. Then one prophet. Then, one part of Revelation. Then back, that's the path that I follow. Round and round and round and round. And wow, you get a well and not a shallow pit. And the benefit of it is significant, because again, it's not dependent on the environment. It's not dependent on having the ground saturated with people who actually have some water to share. Okay, so let's press on. You want to take a break, Carl? Do you think we should stretch, or should I keep going?
And you say no.
Huh?
Or say no.
Go. Okay. Acknowledge and overcome the historic, personal, cultural distance. Let's just be honest that the Bible is speaking out of a world that we're unfamiliar with. And in order to actually kind of understand it, we're going to have to get some ability to cross over the divide. If you can follow me for a minute, just kind of picture this. So here's the Bible. Here's us. We live in the early part of our century, a few thousand years plus removed from the book. Complete cultural distance and a perspective of life distance and language and practices and history and geography, and it's all foreign. It's all way over there. And so what I'm really after is, I'm after some familiarity, some ability to move my life from where it is over here to where the Bible is. One of the key things I like to remind people of in terms of the ancient world that begins to help unlock the Old Testament in particular, and that is that the ancient world is a world of survival. Like everyone's focused on surviving. And so it's not, unless you live in the urban core and kind of gang violence dominated day-to-day life is in question, or you live in the third world and in situations of famine and war, that you don't understand the ancient world. You don't understand day-to-day survival. So because you and I live over here, where survival is really not our question, satisfaction is our question. Like, what does it take to be satisfied? That is a completely different, dominating question of life in the ancient world. So we read some of the harsh things of the Old Testament, and from the perspective of satisfaction, they just make us go tilt. Mm-hmm. But from the perspective of survival, it's different. So it's like that. It's like I got to cross over to somehow at least appreciate what's happening over here on this basis. But this isn't the goal. This is, if you want to draw a triangle on your paper, just draw a triangle. And we're on the bottom of the triangle. You can draw a little stick figure of you over here, a little scroll or a book of the Bible over here. And on that bottom part of the triangle, write what, where, when, who. What, where, when, who. We're trying to familiarize ourselves with what's going on, who's doing it, where did it happen, when did it happen, just the basics of crossing distance. And you might say, well, how am I going to do that? Well, it is so easy for you now that why don't you buy a study Bible? It has, like, it right there. A lot of information for you right there, you know. I picture in heaven one day sitting on one of the gold, I assume they're going to be gold, the park benches, and I'm sitting there, and the Apostle Paul sits down. And we're going to start talking. And I'm going to say, Paul, you know, you lived during a time when the great library in Alexandria, all these things that are lost to history, and you had, you were a scholar, and you sat with Gamaliel. What was it like to have these different perspectives? And he's going to look at me and say, forget that. What was it like to have a study Bible? You know, like, to whom much is given, much is required.
Well,
you know, we have more access to this pathway of understanding than ever has existed. Is there a reason for that? I think so. I think a whole bunch of us are meant to have wells, a little understanding of who, where, when, what. So all this is knowledge. You can put that along with the who, where, when, but it's all knowledge. Like, I'm getting some biblical knowledge here. That's not the end goal. Is not knowledge. And in fact, if you only have knowledge, knowledge puffs up. You think you know the Bible, you don't really know. The Pharisees knew everywhere, when, what, question, who. They could drive a nail, through the scroll of the text and know what letter it came out on the other side. You know, those details, they had it. Jesus says, you know, but you don't know. So knowledge is not the goal. Knowledge just gives us access to the goal, because when we move our life from here to here in the Word with some familiarity, we're able to ask this really, absolutely essential question. And that question is, why? To God, who's at the top of the pyramid, why is that here? Why is that written? Why is that recorded? Why did you say that, do that? Why did they say that, do that? What was in your heart and mind that's always and forever true, universal, eternal truth, is being expressed in this context? Why? And when you hear that why, you know that. See, the why is not a result of study. It's not the result of information gathering or knowledge. The why is revelation. The why is the Spirit takes what belongs to Christ and makes it known to you. The why is, this is the heart of the matter. This is where God is coming from. And so the why is a revelatory experience. It's, God, why? And then when we have the why, then we can come back to our life where we live it right now, and we can turn back to God knowing something of the truth that's always and everywhere true, that is found there. But here, right now, we can say, how? How do I apply that in my life?
wow, that's good.
Now we have a dynamic, friends. We have a conversation. The Bible is never meant to be a monologue, something you read like you listen to a sermon where you just let the Bible preach at you. You open it and read it, let it preach at you. The Bible's always meant to be a dialogue that's full of questions and answers. And I'm asking these questions, and I'm having to use some effort to find those answers. But the essential questions God has to answer, and He's willing to answer. He's committed to answer. But He wants us to know kind of why and how. Let me give you an illustration, okay? Here's the very important illustration, because I'm not just telling you like my idea of things, or I'm not, what I've just basically described is an inductive form of Bible study that uses questions and answers, and that, like inductive Bible study's been around. It wasn't invented by InterVarsity or whoever else, Actually, it's the rabbinic method, So when a rabbi had students in the ancient world, unless they were super successful and famous and well known, then maybe they had a building to meet in. Most of them met under a tree with their disciples, and they would have a text, and they would roll out the text, and they would ask their students to read it. Then they would ask them questions about what they read, and in their answers they would lead them to an understanding. This is the key to understanding Jesus at the temple at the age of 12. when his parents leave him behind. They go back to find him. He's in the temple with the scholars. It says he's asking them questions, and they're amazed at his understanding. You see, he's leading them as a rabbi at the age of 12, the scholars of Israel. He's leading them by questioning them into an understanding that they did not possess. And so this is the method of Jesus. And so here's an example. So Jesus, teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most controversial parts is his dealing with the law. And he says, the law says this, but I say that. And so people wonder, is Jesus giving a new law? Is Jesus abrogating the law that was? Like, what's Jesus? Very, wow, that's big stuff to say, well, the law says this, but I say this. And in fact, what's happening is this, he's taking people through this exact method. So he says to them, they're the disciples and him, they're in first century Roman world, and he says the law says an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. So let's walk over there. The law says actually 3 times an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, all in the context of Israel coming out of Egypt, preparing themselves to become a nation of priests, a people of God, and they're being given in the law, in part, what they're given as a standard of justice. Now, that's what eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is, a standard of justice. It's what we would call reciprocal justice. In other words, you injure me, I get to injure you back at a reciprocal, kind of equal level. That is absolutely, in 1000 BC, a revolutionary idea. Because the ancient world, the standard of justice is blood vengeance. And blood vengeance works like this. You injure me and I kill you. It's escalated retaliation. So Lamech's boast, Genesis 4, do you remember this passage? It's the descent towards the total corruption of the time of Noah. But Lamech is a descendant of Cain, and he boasts, to his wives, who he's trying to intimidate and abuse. He says, a boy bruises me, I kill him. I return 77 times what is given to me. This is justice in the ancient world. And so the law is filled with bizarre laws, like about, if your neighbor's ox gets out of the neighbor's property, comes rampaging through your property and gores your child, then the ox gets put to death and compensation is made. Well, in the ancient world that happens, and I come out and find the lifeless body of my daughter and the bloody horns of your oxen, I send a runner to get all of my relatives, and they come literally running with hoes, and if they had swords, whatever they had, and we go next door and we kill everyone we find in the house next door.
Right.
And then we go to their relatives and kill them. That's the ancient world. When I talk about survival in the ancient world, this is the world you're having to survive in. So escalating blood vengeance is the standard of justice in the ancient world. And so the law says, in what? A restraining way.
Right.
No. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, that's the why part, right? Why God, you say that? Because I'm trying to restrain personal retaliation. Trying to restrain blood vengeance. Trying to hold it back in the hearts and lives of my people, right? Okay, back over here to Jesus. First century Roman world, different world. Why? Because of the Romans. The Romans were an oppressive, dominating power. But the one thing they did was they hated hassle. They hated rebellion. They hated things to be in turmoil. They wanted peace in their empire. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. How do you get peace? Well, they decided that brute force did not produce it. That the best way was that you could appeal to laws. That the rule of law would create this widespread peace. And so now the standard of justice is no longer escalating blood vengeance of 1,000 years before, but it is this rule of law And so Jesus says, the law says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. What is Jesus saying? Something brand new? No, that thing that's always and everywhere true in the heart of God, that you restrain personal retaliation. Guess what? In our context, he wants to restrain it even more. He wants to hold your heart back from taking vengeance over the wrong done to you. Now, you might think, well, that's a lovely, almost Gandhian thought right there. That's just a lovely thought. No, it was more than that. If the disciples hadn't believed that, if Paul had thought when he was picking himself bloody off the ground, when he was stoned near to death, he would have thought, I'm going to go back, and the law says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I'm going to go back in there and throw in some rocks. I tell you, the Christian mission would have been over fast. The Christian mission was built on the suffering, unreturned vengeance of saints and servants who were willing to bear a price to love people who were unlovable. It was everything. And so, knowing what's in the heart, it wasn't different. It's a different context. It's a different time. And so the dynamic of that, what I'm after is this liberating truth. That's what the truth will set you free. There's truth there in the heart of God that's for everyone, everywhere. And when I get a hold of that in His Word, it's in a different context, foreign to us. We have to familiarize ourselves somewhat with it to get a hold of it, to find the why. But being able to apply that why in my life now, not only will that be liberating to me, it will be liberating through me to others. We'll press on. Okay, power of paradox. You got to recognize that there's power in paradox. What I mean by paradox is when truths seem to be in tension, that they're running opposite directions and they crash into one another, and it feels like there's nowhere to go with that. And so, spiritual truth almost always comes in a package form that has multiple truths in tension. Sometimes they're in absolute, running in opposite directions, and they crash into one another. A classic kind of Christian theological example of this is those who believe kind of in the sovereignty of God and those who believe in the free will of man. And those things run into each other at some point, and how you resolve that crash, some will say, well, the sovereignty of God is stronger, so it just runs over the free will of man, or free will of man is stronger, so it runs over the sovereignty of God. But they actually crash together, and the power is in the tension.
Right.
The power is in that they're in tension together. It goes, the list just tumble on. How about forgiveness? This essential thing of kind of Christian belief and need. That there's forgiveness offered to us freely, full of grace in Christ. We didn't earn it, we didn't deserve it. He did it for us, and so we can receive it freely. But then Jesus teaches if you don't forgive others, then He won't forgive you. Oh, no! Those run together. Like I can receive freely the forgiveness that's come to me in Jesus, and I didn't qualify for it, and then, I got to forgive others so I can experience forgiveness. It's tension. There's a paradox. There's things that are rubbing against each other, and the power is in that tension. You don't want to resolve it. You don't want to run over it. No, it's all just about it. Just free. Just receive forgiveness. Don't worry about if you ever need to forgive it. And it doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. The power is in the tension. The problem is dealing with the tension. How do I actually function in a non-paralyzing way with the tension? This is going to spill over into the next point, learning to think biblically. Here's the problem about how we learn to think. That we have learned to think in the West in a very linear way, in a very straightforward way, which works amazingly well, in certain disciplines. And it certainly been the key that has enabled the West to lead in technology.
Right.
So, here's linear thinking. 1 + 2 = 3. It's in a straight line. Boom. There it is. There's the truth at the end of the straight line. If you think in that kind of linear way with the Bible, then you literally have all these trains running together.
Right.
All these tracks running into each other, and there's a crash, and you go, I don't know what to do with that crash. Is God sovereign, or people free will, or do I forgive, or am I forgiven, or, on and on and on it goes. It's just, I don't know what, I'm just stuck, I'm just in the crash zone, I don't know what to do, and the ultimate answer is that there's a dynamic about truth that helps us to think biblically. Now, I was talking over the break prior, in the Hebrew kind of thing, it's more like a circle. It moves around in a circle. Well, that doesn't really work either. The thing that actually, to me, fits what happens with spiritual truth and the way that we actually come to function in a liberating way with truth is more like, here's how I saw it. I was really wrestling with this. I said, I don't understand how this is going to work. And then I had a vision, image. And I saw a fire writing, not words, but it was like this, spiraling forward, like that. Like these looping circles moving forward. And I thought, what is that? And then I saw it. It was like lights on the pedals of a bicycle. Like if that's all you could see at nighttime, the path that these bicycle pedals would lead forward. And I understood that dealing with paradox, thinking biblically, is like riding a bicycle. That you push down on the pedal that's up. And then the other pedal comes up. And you push down on that pedal. And then the other pedal comes up. And you push down on that pedal. But pretty soon, you're just pedaling. You're not aware of which pedal is up. But getting the bike started, then you're aware. I don't know if any of you have ever had a one-pedal bicycle. I've had one. I told you I was poor. I had a one-pedal bike. I want to tell you, they don't work good. A one-pedal bike's not bad on the flat. You kind of push down really hard, and then it hits you in the back of the leg coming around, and you catch it again. And it's like a scooter, kind of an advanced scooter. You're just pedaling away, one at a time. And going downhill, fantastic. Might as well have two pedals on the bike. It's so easy. But going uphill, impossible. That's the way it is to think biblically. Some ways of thinking work on the flat, or most work going downhill, but going uphill, then now you gotta know how to ride. Now you gotta have two pedals. So you push down on the pedal that's up. So for instance, I'm dealing with guilt and self-condemnation and self-hatred and poor identity and all these things, and I encounter the gospel that says that God has moved into my failure and brokenness, and He's loved me, and He's freed me, and He's forgiven me without my earning it or qualifying for it, that I can receive it as a gift, and I let that wash over me. In the depth of my despair, I let that wash over me, and I push down on that pedal with all my might. And interestingly, this other pedal comes up that says, and now, those people that have hurt you, forgive them like I've forgiven you. Push down on that. If you do, wow, the resources of heaven are available to me of mercy. And what if I'm stuck in life and I'm just dealing with bitterness and anger? They did me wrong, and they did me wrong, and I guess then the pedal that's up on my bike is I ought to better forgive so I can be forgiven. So that my mistakes and errors, and so I'll push down hard on forgiving others and see what pedal can see it. Pretty soon though, you're riding the bike, and I don't know, riding a bike well is just fun. It just feels like life and freedom and movement. And that's the way that truth is supposed to operate in our life, in a dynamic way that propels us forward. And so we find that that way of dealing with things. Not by being stuck, not being paralyzed by paradox, but by actually, and again, how do you ride a bike? You don't just push down the pedal with a little bit of your weight. You want to start the bike, you put everything into it. Like, that's why, do I believe in the sovereignty of God? Absolutely. Full on. I'm all in. Do I believe in the free will of man? Absolutely. Full on. I'm all in.
So good.
It's like, I'm going to put all my weight on them because it's going to move it forward. I'm going to have both accountability and responsibility in my life and a sense of assurance and awareness that kind of God has the final say. It's going to work. It's going to work. You like that? You've always liked that one, Carl.
Yeah, I've always
Goodbye.
liked it.
I call it. What do I call it? The paradoxical. Oh, you guys are slow. The paradox cycle. Yeah. Okay. That's terrible, isn't it? Okay, we'll be finished here. We're gonna make it. We're gonna be finished in time to ask a few questions. Choose nobility. You know what's said about the Bereans in the book of Acts, that they hear this stuff, and it said they searched the scriptures because they were more noble than the last group. And there's a nobility about searching. It's not just the destination that's important. It is the search. It's the discovery. It's the effort that actually counts. And so none of that, those hard hours of reading through genealogies and thinking, when's this ever going to end? And none of that goes for naught. That the journey itself is really important, and there's a nobility to have. And there's part of that nobility is this, that it's just way too easy. And I talk about, we live in an information-saturated time, right? 24-hour news cycles, and any kind of viewpoint you want, you can get a cable channel for, and there's a nobility in having your own mind. There's a nobility in having your own well.
Good.
And not just, relying on, well, the pastor's got a really great well, and I love drinking from it. Or this author, I just really love. I'm not at all discounting preaching or books or aids of any kind in terms of the journey, but having your own well where you've had that conversation. It's your conversation with God. Why? And His answer, and your question, how, and His answer. That history of your life, it's worth it. There's a nobility about having your own well. Last thing is you got to make it a practical priority. That it has to work out in the schedule and the pattern of your life somehow. And I believe about this like I believe about physical exercise. I've seen so many people, I've done it myself. Yeah, I got to get in shape, and then I go to the gym for 2 hours and I can't walk the next day, and I'm unlikely to go back. And you got to do it in a sustainable way. You got to do it in a way. Here's the most critical choice about your practical decision of where does Bible reading, Bible study, Bible exposure fit in your life. The number one most important thing is it sustainable for me? Can I do this and then get off track and get back to it easily? Like, if I can do that, if that's my minimum, then great. Let it be inflated here or there, or this day or that. But honestly, you can get through the entire 7 sections, reading them all for the first time in a 2-year thing with 20 minutes a day. Like, that's not, throw them all together. That's a couple hours sit down on an evening or something. It's not impossible. It's not beyond, investment. And so I make this practical decision. Here's how I'm going to set off, and It's going to be sustainable. It's going to be repeatable. I'm going to be able to get back to it when I get off track. And that's the key. That's the key. And over time, you'll think, oh, I'm just never making any progress. And suddenly you're 4 or 5 years down the road and, wow, I have a depth and a stability and a flow of encouragement, in my life, strength, comfort, and encouragement. I have a flow of that in my life that I didn't have before. And now it's worth everything. That sense that God is with me, that He's speaking to me, that He has access to my heart and my life, and that foundation and filter and shield is in place in my life to foster and protect intimacy, to make it so that it can continue to grow and thrive. Anybody want to ask a question? Want to talk about something in particular? Where did Cain and Abel's wives come from? Who are the Nephilim?
All that fun stuff.
Yes. Anybody have any thoughts, comments? They all want to go home a half hour early, Carl.
That's good.
I do have a
Sure.
silly question.
No silly questions.
Where did it come from that Paul was knocked off a horse? Because I never have read that in Scripture.
You just did.
I don't know where that came from.
You fell off.
And I've even repeated it myself and then realized that's not what it says. It says he was knocked down. It doesn't say he was knocked off a horse.
True enough.
Did I read that wrong?
No.
Oh.
No, it's from Jerusalem to Damascus, it's a significant journey. And Paul was a representative of the Sanhedrin, so he's a person of some resource. So it's unlikely that he'd been walking. So was it a donkey or a horse or a cart or, that it's the conclusion of other factors. But it's not, you're right, doesn't say it, doesn't necessarily mean it was true. It's just more than likely the way it was. There's another thing that Paul, he obviously talks about the loss of all things. Paul was an official, it's highly unlikely he was never married. It's more likely that he was married and his faith in Christ cost him all family. That's more likely. So, it's just things like that. It's just putting together what we know of the day and how things work with what it says. So, but you're right. He could have been walking alongside the donkey. He could have, been taking a potty break when he got knocked down. I don't know. Anybody else? Yes.
Got a unique question. Do you think the rapture and the second coming of Jesus are two different events or one and the same?
Okay, let's step right into some controversy right now.
I've heard both. Let's just do that.
Okay.
Lately,
Let me say what I know, and then you'll know what I believe.
Carl doesn't like me anymore.
No one in the history of Christianity has ever believed in the rapture except prosperous North Americans. No one. And the thought in the 20th century. Yeah, you can't say all American, and you can't say all Americans today, but no one has ever believed that except coming out of North America and in the 20th century. Now, here's the other thing, that the tribulation, it is unimaginable to people Christians who've lived through the slaughter of villages and nations and in times past, could ever imagine a tribulation worse than what they experienced. Right? So, for instance, in Kansas City, we had a group of people who were living on a farm in Zimbabwe. We purchased some land. We were trying to work with local tribes, building weirs for water retention and showing sustainable farming. we stepped into historic racial conflict, and we're trying to do a good thing without a lot of understanding of local dynamics. And so one evening, tribal members came into the property where we had 18 or 20 men and women and children, and they hacked them all to pieces with machetes. It'd be hard to tell those people that they hadn't lived through the tribulation. So the idea that somehow we who've only known mostly comfort and not persecution are going to be spared of anything really awful, it does seem a little suspect to me, like that viewpoint of the world. I have cancer, for goodness sake. I just had one of my dearest friends die. We were diagnosed at the same time, not of the same kind of cancer. But some of you know better than I, but I've witnessed it. It's a painful journey to the bottom. And so I'm supposed to think that God is just going to pluck me out so that I don't have to go through when literally hundreds of millions of my brothers and sisters have gone through war. It just seems to me like that's speaking to a place that I could easily agree with, but it may not be true. And so is the second coming of Christ and the rapture the same thing? I would have to say that the rapture to me is very much in question, and the second coming of Christ is not. So I absolutely believe in the second coming of Christ, but I'm completely I'm convinced about the rapture. Sorry, that's my take on it. And some of you who love that, God bless you. I hope it brings you something. I hope it's real and not just a false kind of thing. Yeah. And here's the bottom line on a lot of controversial issues. I always think about standing before Jesus. And I've had, facing death. You start looking at the passages that have to do with what happens right after. I want whatever insight the Bible has on that, I really would like to take that into account. You know what's shocking about particularly what Jesus says? Like things like the story of Lazarus, right? The beggar at the gate, and the worst of all, the parable of the sheep and goats, that Jesus anticipates that after our death, that we're not going to be given a doctrinal quiz, that we're not going to have a moral inventory of our personal peccadillos.
That's good.
We are going to be questioned about how we treated people, particularly if they were hungry or naked or in prison or lonely, people who are vulnerable. That's what we'll be questioned about. I think that's really key. Because sometimes I imagine, going through the interrogation of Jesus, and I just can't imagine Jesus saying to him, man, you didn't believe in the rapture. Like, what's wrong with you? I can't imagine him saying to me, wow, you believed in the rapture. What's wrong with you? I had a woman in my church right across the catty corner from our campus. There's this little old building, and Seventh-day Adventist group moved in there, God bless them. But like hardcore Seventh-day Adventists believe that if you don't worship on the Sabbath, then you're going to hell, right? So this little lady was part of the Vineyard, my church, for years. She went over there across the street, and she came back to meet with me about 6 months after she there, and she said to me in a very challenging way, she said, Pastor, how do you feel about leading all these people to hell? I said to her, I don't feel very good about it. I said, I assume you're talking about Saturday and the Sabbath. And I said, hey, we have a Saturday night. Does that count? Of course, I knew it didn't because it's after sunset, so it doesn't count. And I said to her, I appreciate the question, but let me say this: do you actually believe that the God you know and worship, the one who sent his Son to die for your sins and mine, that he looks down from heaven at 4,000 or 5,000 people that gather at the Vineyard and think, wow, their lives are pretty much a mess, but they're trying really hard, but they got the day wrong, so go to hell. Mm-hmm. Is that who you know God to be?
Good.
Because that's not who I know God to be.
Yeah.
And so these issues of what's the question? How am I going to answer it? What's he concerned about? I have a feeling that some of our obsessions, some of our preoccupations, some of the things that interest us don't interest him very much. And part of the process of discipleship is learning to love what he loves. And when I read the parable of the sheep and goats, I just think, God, I want to have a whole crowd of people who can testify that I loved them naked, I loved them cold, I loved them lonely, I loved them bound up, that I reached for them to resource them, to care about them, that if I don't have that, then I'm worried. But if I didn't believe the technicalities, right, yeah. And people say, well, what about, what about this? You're not being hard enough on that. And I say again, I'm going to take my chances. If God's going to say to me, David, you were just too gracious to people, I'll own that. And I will embrace whatever consequence comes with that.
Wow.
But I want to avoid very much
Wow.
having him to say to me, like he said to the Pharisees, you put burdens on people they could not carry.
Wow. Come on.
Like, I want to avoid that conversation very much. I'll take the other one, like, well, you're just such a liberal softy. Okay, I own it. If there's some kind of paddling involved, go ahead. If there's time to spend in purgatory, I didn't believe it, but I'll spend it there. Can I pray for you guys? Can I just say I enjoyed spending the time with you. I hope this has been worthwhile to you. I suggest to you, like all things, chew the meat, spit out the bones. If they're worthwhile things, take them in. If there aren't, let them go. The others set on the shelf. So Father, thank you. So thank you so much for this day. Thank you for these friends and brothers and sisters. And Lord, we do pray, lead us to a place of health and strength and maturity and wholeness and completion. Lead us there, God. Even from this point forward, God, mature us and grow us and use us and cause our lives to be a blessing to you and to others. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
There's just so much. It's so rich and very helpful. You might choke on the rapture bone, but don't worry about it. But it really isn't something that's very clear, and the end times messages aren't really clear. I've read 4 or 5 different theologians on the same passages in Matthew 24 and 25, and they all come up with different conclusions. And that might have something to do with Jesus saying, no man knows the hour of the day.
Yeah.
But we are obsessed with that stuff. One thing I would say, one is incredible, great stuff. I mean, David shared the well thing with me years ago, because I used to read the Bible like 4 or 5 hours a day, but I wasn't retaining anything. And I said, how do I do that? And so he showed me that's the story of digging a well rather than the little spots and stuff like that. And that was very helpful. And then, of course, I've already told you how to use the bicycle one before. I didn't have the pun attached to it, but which is really the best part. But the one word I would have for you, or one statement as your pastor, as one of your pastors, is that we've had people come in here for I think it's like a second year now, and they've all done a wonderful job, and they've all been a blessing. But there's one common thread with all of them, almost all of them, is that I've known them, and so I vouch for them. And there's been a couple times that we've had people that I really don't know that well, and I would not repeat that again because you can't correct them. And I won't have anybody in here that I can't say that was wrong, and that I can't hold accountable for what they're saying. And so I would just advise you, because I know there are a million voices out there now, and there's some really loud ones, and so they're either on podcasts or on broadcasts or whatever, and I would weigh things accordingly. If I don't know them at all, I don't know their life, I don't know anything about them, I would give it way less weight than somebody I know. So that doesn't mean you don't listen or don't take it in, but don't weigh it like it's profound and weighty. You need to know the people, and that's why the church is important, because we know each other and when we can grow together. What he just prayed at the end, that's really what we want to do. We want to grow up and mature in him and know him and represent him well. And there's just not a lot of bells and whistles with it. But if we just keep doing it, we'll see the fruit of it. And I told David about, I don't want to embarrass you, but I am. I told David about you, Bethany. I know, of all people. And just how shy you were when I met you. And yet, in the recent time, we've had just evidence of real growth and a blossoming. But we didn't see it happening what was going on. But she just kept showing up and being faithful and doing stuff that she didn't want to do. And she was really honest about, I don't want to do this, but I'll do it. But then all of a sudden you see this young woman, maturing and growing and blossoming. And that's what the church is like. And that's why I say it's not a conference, it's not a big hurrah thing. We got a lot of it, we got plenty of that. And if you want to participate in that, that's fine. But don't compare that to this. This is somewhere where we show up faithfully, love each other, support each other, open the Word of God. We're trying to read through the New Testament together for 40 days. And when we're done with that, I think we'll set up another thing that's a little bit more familiar with what David's saying. But I just want to continue to pour into you and have people for you that are brilliant. I thought David was brilliant today. And I'd like to listen to it again and again, because he said so many things that are so helpful and so good and so wise. And I feel really privileged. Yeah.
That's a good word right there.
I can't go any further. We both cry very easily because
It's the result of chemotherapy.
yeah. Well, you had a stroke. I had a stroke. I do cry a lot more easily now. I'm really commercials. I'm
Please.
in big trouble. But anyway, I really love him, and I love the fact that he and Nancy are my friends. I love to have friends like that, because I always, anytime I'm with them, I feel replenished and encouraged and helped in a wonderful way. So anyway, I was glad. I'm glad for today. I'm glad for tomorrow. It'll be great. Right? Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you.